My stepmother sat beside my father's bed every afternoon for 14 months. She held his hand. She called herself family. What she had already done, before I knew what to look for, was walk into an attorney's office with a document she believed would redirect everything my father had spent 30 years building, away from me and toward herself. She had done it carefully, in the window she had identified and waited for, during the weeks when my father's medication made the edges of his thinking soft enough that a document placed in front of him with a calm explanation attached to it would be signed without the sustained scrutiny it deserved. She had done it with the help of an attorney who asked the questions that needed asking and none of the ones that did not. She had done it while I was sitting in the same hospital 6 miles away holding my father's hand and reading to him from the books he liked and believing, in the way you believe things about people you have chosen to trust, that the woman beside him was there for the same reasons I was. What she had not done, because she did not know it needed doing, was call the one person whose written confirmation was legally required before that document could take effect under the specific terms of the trust it was amending. She did not call me because she did not know who I was. She knew me as Vera, my father's daughter. A warm, quiet woman who worked in law in some peripheral way and who had taken her father's illness very hard and who was, by every outward measure, someone you could afford not to worry about. She had known me that way for 4 years, across holidays and hospital waiting rooms and kitchen counters and the small ordinary accumulation of a relationship I had believed was genuine and which, in the ways that mattered most to me then, had been. I had liked Colette. I want to say that at the beginning so that what follows is understood correctly. The grief of this story is not the grief of discovering that someone you already suspected was capable of betrayal had gone ahead and done it. The grief of this story is discovering that someone you had genuinely loved had been building something against you in the space between your visits, in the time you were not there to see, using the proximity that your trust had given her as the instrument of exactly the thing you had trusted her not to do. What I was, and what no one in that attorney's office had thought to verify, was the person who had drafted the original trust. I had sat at my father's desk 12 years earlier, the same desk where he had kept his ceramic fish dish for as long as I could remember, a fat brown fish with its mouth open wide that he had bought at a roadside market when I was 7 and which had sat in the right corner of that desk through every year of my childhood and every year after it. I had sat across from that dish with my father and we had built the trust together, his instructions and my knowledge, his intentions and my architecture, and when we had finished I had built into it something he had specifically requested. A protection. A custom amendment procedure that required 3 distinct steps before any modification could take legal effect, steps that had not been taken, steps that had not even been known about by the attorney Colette had chosen, because she had handed Gregory Holt a document without telling him how it had been made and he had amended it as if it were something ordinary. She handed him a weapon I had designed. She handed it to him inside a structure I had built. And I had been watching her for 3 months before she made her move. This is the story of what I had already prepared by the time she thought she was winning. The fish dish was still there when I walked into my father's study the morning after I found the document. It always was. That small ceramic thing had sat on the right corner of his desk for as long as I could remember, and I had done my homework across from it while he reviewed structural drawings, and I had read through law school casebooks at that desk while he worked late and the house settled around us with the sounds of a building that had been loved for a long time. When I passed the bar he put a small folded note inside the dish's open mouth and told me to read it before I started my first day of work. The note said, "Build things that hold." 3 words. That was my father. He did not waste language. I thought about that dish for 3 days straight after I found the document. Not continuously, not obsessively, but in the way you find yourself returning to something ordinary when everything around it has become unrecognizable. I kept coming back to the image of it sitting on his desk while he was 6 miles away in a hospital bed with a treatment line in his arm, not knowing what was being done in his name, and the fish dish just waiting, mouth open, holding whatever someone chose to put inside it. The document was in a manila envelope inside a leather bag that Colette kept over her shoulder at every hospital visit. I had noticed the bag 3 weeks before I opened it. Not the bag itself, which I had seen before, but the way she held it. There is a particular quality to the way people carry things they are managing carefully, a slight asymmetry in how they distribute their weight, a minor compression in the shoulder on the side where the important thing lives. I am trained to notice the things people do not intend to show. 11 years of trusts and estates work teaches you to read rooms, to understand the body language of documents and the people who are moving them around. I had been watching Colette for 3 months before that morning. What I mean by watching is not surveillance in any dramatic sense. I mean attention. The particular, sustained, disciplined attention that I brought to every case I had ever worked, applied now to the woman my father had married 4 years ago and who sat beside his bed every afternoon and held his hand and said she would take care of everything. She used that phrase frequently. I will take care of everything. It was the kind of phrase that was designed to be reassuring, and in the beginning it had been. After my father's diagnosis, there had been so much to manage. The medical appointments, the insurance correspondence, the coordination between his various specialists, the adjustments to the house for when he came home between treatment phases. Colette had moved into all of that space with an efficiency I had genuinely admired. She was organized and calm, and she had a natural authority in rooms where decisions needed to be made quickly. The first time something registered differently for me was a conversation in February. We were sitting in the family waiting room at the hospital during a longer procedure, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had spoken to someone about simplifying his estate documents. That was the word she used, simplifying. I asked her what that meant. She said my father had expressed a desire to reduce the complexity of his arrangements, that he found it stressful to think about, and that she was going to help him get everything into a cleaner shape. I said that sounded reasonable and asked whether she had someone in mind. She named a firm I did not recognize and said a colleague had recommended them. I did not say anything else about it that day. I put the conversation in the folder I was building in my mind and went back to the waiting room chair and the coffee I had been holding and the magazine I had not been reading, and I thought about the word simplifying and what it could mean in the context of an estate plan that I had drafted myself 12 years ago, built specifically to resist simplification by anyone other than my father acting with full independent counsel. 3 weeks later, at the hospital, she left her bag on the chair beside me when she went to use the restroom. She was gone less than 4 minutes. I had the envelope out and photographed before she reached the end of the corridor. I am not going to tell you that photographing those documents felt clean or comfortable. It did not. It felt like exactly the kind of thing you do when you are trying to protect someone and the ordinary avenues for protection have been quietly closed off. It felt necessary and cold and true, and I put the envelope back in the bag and set the bag where it had been and looked at the cover of the magazine I was not reading, and when Colette came back I told her she had beautiful earrings and she touched them and smiled and said they had been her grandmother's. That night, in my car in the parking garage, I read what I had photographed. The document was dated 6 weeks prior. It was a trust amendment, executed under the name of my father, witnessed and notarized, that restructured substantially the entire estate he had built across more than 3 decades. The original trust, which I had drafted in the months after my mother died, had been designed to pass everything directly to me: the house on Birch Hollow Road where I had grown up and where my mother had kept her annotated books and her sharp kitchen knives, the investment accounts my father had been building with patient discipline since before I was born, and a separately designated family trust that he had established specifically and explicitly in my name, described in the original document in language we had written together, sitting at his desk, the fish dish between us, he and I deciding together what mattered and where it should go. The amendment redirected all of it. The house, the accounts, the family trust. Everything restructured into a new arrangement that named Colette as sole trustee and primary beneficiary. There was a charitable remainder to an organization I had never heard of, which I noted immediately as a structure sometimes used to create the appearance of generosity while concentrating control. There was a nominal distribution to me, specific enough in its smallness to suggest it had been calculated rather than arrived at accidentally. I recognized the name of the drafting attorney. Gregory Holt. I had appeared against him twice in probate court, once in a contested will matter and once in a dispute involving a family limited partnership that had been used, unsuccessfully in the end, to dilute a beneficiary's share. He was not sloppy in the way that careless attorneys are sloppy. He was precise and narrow, the kind of practitioner who constructed documents that looked correct from the outside without always being sound at their center. He was also, and I had learned this about him the second time we were on opposite sides, the kind of attorney who did not ask the questions that might complicate an otherwise clean engagement. What Gregory Holt did not know, and what Colette had not thought to tell him because she did not know it either, was that the trust he had amended contained a specific and binding amendment procedure that I had drafted with my father's explicit instruction 12 years ago. Not a boilerplate provision. A custom, 3-part requirement that we had built in deliberately, at my father's request, because he had said to me that morning at his desk, "I want this to be something that cannot be touched without my full understanding and participation. I wanted to require more than a signature on a bad day. I wanted to require a process that takes time, that involves people who are accountable, that cannot be done quietly." We had built exactly that. The amendment clause required 3 things that had clearly not been done: an independent review by counsel of the amending parties' choosing, a 30-day written notice to all named beneficiaries, and a notarized confirmation from the original drafting attorney before any amendment could take legal effect. I was the original drafting attorney. No one had called me. No notice had been sent. The independent review was not mentioned anywhere in the document. On its face, the amendment was void. Not voidable, not contestable in the sense of a close call that might go either way depending on the judge's disposition. Void. The execution had not followed the procedure required by the document itself, which meant the amendment had no legal effect regardless of how many signatures were on it, regardless of the notary's seal, regardless of whether my father had been of perfectly sound mind or not at the time of signing, though I intended to contest that too. What I felt, sitting in my car reading this on my phone screen, was not the thing people expect you to feel in a moment like that. It was not rage. It was not grief, exactly, though grief was there underneath everything else, because I had loved Colette, or something I believed was Colette, in a way that had been genuine and glad and without reservation, and that love was now being forced to coexist with what I was looking at on my screen. What I felt primarily was a very particular and focused clarity. The kind that comes when a problem you have been peripherally sensing suddenly becomes fully visible and the path forward resolves from fog into something you can see and measure and plan. I sat in the car for 40 minutes. I did not cry. I laid out, in the notes application on my phone, the sequence of steps that would need to happen in the correct order to make everything right again. When I had finished the list, I looked at it for a while. Then I drove inside, changed my clothes, made dinner, and waited for Colette to arrive. She came at 7:30. She was wearing the earrings she had said were her grandmother's, and she set down her bag on the bench by the door the way she always did, and she asked whether I had eaten and I said I was just finishing and did she want a plate. She said yes and sat at the counter and told me about her afternoon at the hospital, how my father had been alert for a while and had wanted to watch a documentary about bridges, which made me smile genuinely because it was exactly the kind of thing he would want. I poured her a glass of wine. We ate together. She told me a small story about something that had happened in the parking garage that I laughed at because it was actually funny. We cleaned up the kitchen side by side and talked about whether the spring was going to come early this year based on what the trees were doing, and then she said she was tired and was going to read for a while and I said goodnight. I sat in my office until 2 in the morning. I had case files to review for existing clients but I did not review them. I worked instead on what I was already thinking of privately as the Callahan matter, building a chronological record from the beginning, dating each piece of evidence from the first conversation I had noticed to the document I had photographed that evening, ordering it the way I would have ordered any file I intended to bring into a court proceeding, precisely, exhaustively, without gaps that could be questioned. By the time I went to bed I had the bones of what would become a formal probate petition, a capacity challenge, a petition for independent review, and a complaint that would be filed with the state bar regarding Gregory Holt's failure to conduct adequate due diligence regarding the amendment procedure required by the original document. I lay in the dark for a while before sleep came, and I thought about the fish dish on my father's desk and the note he had put in its mouth the morning I started my career. 3 words. Build things that hold. I had built one once. I was going to show everyone what it looked like when someone tried to pull it apart. In the morning I made coffee for Colette and had it on the counter before she came downstairs. She touched my arm when she picked it up and said I was so good to her. I said I was glad she was there. She smiled at me with the warm and easy smile that had always made me feel, for the 4 years I had known her, that we were genuinely on the same side. I smiled back. We were both very good at performing the version of ourselves that the other person needed to see. The difference between us was that I had spent 11 years learning to read the distance between what was performed and what was true. I was not going to rush. That was the most important decision I made in that first week, and I made it deliberately, with full awareness of what it cost me emotionally to move at the pace the situation required rather than the pace my feelings wanted. Every day that the amendment sat in Colette's bag was a day she felt safe enough not to take defensive measures, not to move assets, not to consult additional counsel, not to try to accelerate the process in ways that might have complicated what I was building. Every morning I made her coffee. Every evening I asked about my father with genuine care, because that part was never performance. The part where I wanted to know how he was, the part where his condition was the most real and most urgent thing in any room I occupied, that was always true. I drove him to appointments twice a week. I held his hand during the longer procedures. I read to him when he was tired, the same kinds of books he had always liked, precise and detailed books about how things worked, engineering principles, architectural history, the long technical narratives of how human beings had figured out how to make structures stand. He did not know what I was doing. I had decided not to tell him. He was managing enough. His body was managing enough. The last thing I was going to do was introduce into his daily experience the knowledge that the woman beside his bed was also operating against the estate he had built for his daughter. That could wait. Everything could wait until the filing was ready and the case was built and the moment was right. Patience is not a virtue I was born with. It is one I learned, case by case, in the probate courts of this county, where the difference between the parties who prevailed and the parties who did not was almost always preparation and almost never passion. I had seen desperate people lose everything because they had moved too fast and left gaps in their record. I had seen careful people recover situations that looked, from the outside, completely unrecoverable, because they had moved with method and had not let their feelings get ahead of their documentation. I was going to be the careful person. I had always been the careful person. Outside the kitchen window that first morning the yard was beginning to come back from winter. Small green things pushing up through the beds my mother had planted and my father had maintained for 20 years in her memory. The light was the particular pale light of early spring, not warm yet but present, full of the specific promise of things that were about to happen and had not happened yet. I drank my coffee and watched the yard and made a list in my head of every step that still needed to happen. There were 43 steps. I had completed 11. I went back to work. My mother kept her recipe cards in a wooden box that her own mother had given her at her wedding, a small cedar box with a brass clasp and her initials burned into the lid in letters that were slightly uneven because whoever had done the burning had been working by hand. The cards inside were not organized in any system that would have made sense to anyone but her. They were not alphabetical or sorted by meal type or arranged by frequency of use. They were in the order she had encountered them, which meant the oldest cards were at the back and the newest were at the front, and to read through the whole box from front to back was to read something like a biography of her cooking life, the things she had learned most recently visible first, the foundational things she had known longest buried deepest. I used to sit with her in the kitchen while she cooked and watch her go through those cards the way a musician goes through sheet music, with the particular fluency of someone who technically does not need it anymore but who keeps it close because the physical act of having it in hand is part of the ritual. She would read a card she had written 30 years ago and her handwriting would have changed so much that she would sometimes hold it at a slight distance and say, in a tone of fond puzzlement, that she could barely recognize herself in those letters. I have thought about that box a great deal across the months I am going to tell you about. The way she organized the cards according to her own experience of them rather than any external logic. The way the most important things were buried deepest. The way you had to go all the way to the back to understand the foundation of everything in front. My name is Vera Callahan. I want to tell you who I actually am, because most of the people in this story, for most of its duration, did not know. I graduated from law school 22 years ago, in the middle of my class academically and at the top of it in a more particular way, which is that I had, by the time I finished, a clearer understanding of what I wanted to do and why than almost anyone I graduated with. Most of my classmates wanted litigation, wanted the courtrooms and the arguments and the accumulated theatrical power of making a case in front of a judge and jury. I wanted something quieter and more permanent. I wanted to understand the law of what people leave behind. Trusts and estates is not a glamorous specialty. I will say that plainly. It does not generate the kind of professional fame that certain other practices do. The cases are rarely dramatic in the way television dramas are dramatic. There are no juries. There are no opening statements delivered to packed courtrooms. There is instead an extraordinary amount of document drafting, a detailed and sustained engagement with tax law and property law and family law and the places where all three overlap in ways that are genuinely complex, and a particular kind of human engagement that I have come to think of as the most intimate kind of legal work there is. Because what trusts and estates work actually is, stripped of the technical language, is the work of sitting with someone and asking them what do you love, and how do you want to protect it? What do you fear losing, and how do we build something around it that will hold after you are gone? Who do you trust, and who do you trust with what, and what are the conditions under which that trust is given and what are the conditions under which it should be withdrawn? These are not legal questions in the narrow sense. They are questions about a human life, and the documents that result from them are, or should be, a direct expression of that life's priorities. The law provides the structure. The person provides the meaning. My job, for 11 years of practice, was to build structures that were worthy of the meaning people brought to them. I opened my own practice 8 years into my career, at 31. The first 2 years were difficult in the way that most solo practices are difficult, the constant management of overhead against receivables, the work of building a referral network from scratch, the particular loneliness of being responsible for every decision without anyone to consult on the hard moments. But I had a mentor, a woman named Constance Adler who had been practicing estate law in this county since before I was born, and she had told me at the beginning, do the work more carefully than anyone else, and let the work speak. Do not be in a hurry to be known. Be in a hurry to be right. I had followed that advice with a discipline that surprised even me sometimes. I drafted documents with the kind of attention that most attorneys reserved for their most complex litigated matters, regardless of how straightforward any individual estate appeared on its surface. I had seen enough families destroyed by ambiguous language and untested provisions to know that the time to be careful was always before the document was signed, never after. My reputation in the probate court had been built slowly and held firmly. Judges trusted my filings. Opposing counsel knew that my documents had been thought through. Financial institutions and corporate trustees who had seen my work come across their desks began sending me referrals because they had learned that documents bearing my name required less correction and generated fewer disputes. I had built exactly what Constance had told me to build, a practice defined by its quality rather than its visibility. I was not, in any ordinary social sense, secretive about what I did. But I was not defined publicly by my profession in the way that some attorneys are. At dinner parties I was Vera, my father's daughter, a warm and reasonably funny person who liked to cook and read and who had a small law practice of some kind. I had learned from my mother the particular grace of letting people fill in assumptions with whatever was most comfortable for them, and I had never felt the need to correct those assumptions unless someone had a direct and specific reason to know what I actually did. I think of this habit now as one of the most consequential things about me. Not because I intended it to be protective, but because it was. My father met Colette at a gathering hosted by a colleague of his, 3 years after my mother died. He called me afterward to tell me he had met someone interesting, and his voice had a particular quality I had not heard in it for a long time, not since my mother was alive and the house was full in the specific way that it had been when she was in it. He was cautious at first, the way careful people are cautious with good things, afraid to claim them too quickly. I met Colette for the first time at a Sunday lunch my father hosted at the house on Birch Hollow Road, 8 months after he had met her. By then they were clearly committed to each other in the quiet, deliberate way that people who have both lost something approach commitment, slowly, with open eyes, testing the weight of things before trusting them. She was warm and quick and she had a natural ease in social situations that was not performed, or at least did not feel performed. She made my father laugh. She asked me genuine questions and listened to the answers. She was careful with his books and his collections and the specific geography of the house, understanding without being told that the things in it had histories that preceded her. I liked her. I want to say this again because I think it is the most important and most painful fact in this entire story. I liked Colette sincerely, over 4 years, in ways that were specific and accumulated. I liked the way she called me before the holidays to coordinate without overstepping. I liked the way she handled my father's difficult days without drama and without complaint. I liked that she had opinions and defended them and laughed at herself when she was wrong. When she was sick one winter with a respiratory illness that kept her in bed for 10 days, I drove to the house every other day with food and the kind of things my mother used to say you needed when your body was trying to fight something off. I have thought often, across the months since I found the document, about what actually drove Colette to do what she did. I do not believe she hated me. I do not think the motivation was personal in that sense at all. What I think, when I am being as honest as I know how to be, is that Colette looked at my father's estate and made a calculation that people with a particular relationship to money and to opportunity sometimes make, that the person who manages the proximity to wealth has a stronger claim to it than any document says, that nearness confers entitlement, that the daily labor of being present and attentive during the hard months ought to translate into material reward. She had watched my father's health decline. She had managed his calendar and his household and his medical logistics. She had been there in every practical sense, and I think she had come to believe, genuinely, that this constituted a form of earning that the original trust failed to recognize. She was not wrong that she had given things. She was catastrophically wrong about what giving those things entitled her to take. There is something I understand about that logic even while I find it completely indefensible. I have seen it before, in estate contests, the surviving partner who believed their daily presence outweighed the dead person's documented intentions. The feeling is human even when the action built on it is not. What made Colette's version different was the method. The deliberate targeting of the window of my father's diminished capacity. The coordination with an attorney. The connection to her sister and what Patricia had done before her. That was not a person acting on grief or confusion. That was a person who had developed, with help, a practiced approach. Understanding her motivation did not make it easier to sit across the kitchen counter from her every evening. It made it more complicated, which is the honest word for what it was. The grief of what she was doing runs alongside all of that. It does not replace it. I do not know how to make those two things sit in the same space cleanly, because they do not. They are both true and they are in permanent conflict, and I suspect they will be for as long as I carry any of this. My father's diagnosis came 14 months before the morning I found the document. It was one of those diagnoses that arrives in stages, each stage requiring a recalibration of what you thought you understood about the future. The initial news was alarming. The treatment protocol offered a realistic path. The realistic path was demanding and long and required sustained management and produced, in the process, stretches of time when my father was not entirely himself, when the medication changed the quality of his thinking or his pain changed the quality of his attention, when his capacity to make clear and considered decisions was real in a general sense but compromised in its particulars. Those windows of compromised capacity were, I understood now, what Colette and Gregory Holt had used. It had been done carefully. I could see that, even in the anger and grief of knowing it. The timing was not random. The documents had been executed on a day I had checked, cross-referencing the signing date against my father's treatment calendar, during a period when he was between stronger medication protocols, alert enough to sign, but exhausted in a way that would have made sustained critical reading of a long and technical document genuinely difficult. The witnesses, a notary and someone I did not recognize, had been present. The signatures were real. The intention to deceive had been layered into a process that was designed to appear unremarkable. What Colette had not been able to control, because she did not know it existed, was the specific amendment clause I had built into the original document at my father's instruction. She had given Gregory Holt a document without telling him how it had been drafted, or perhaps she had told him in general terms without understanding that a general understanding was not sufficient. Holt had amended the trust as if it were a standard revocable instrument, following the standard procedure, not the bespoke procedure that the document itself required. This was, in legal terms, a fatal defect. Not a fixable irregularity. A structural failure at the foundation of the entire amendment. The first direct move she made against me came in March. My father had been through a difficult stretch, several days of higher pain and the associated medication adjustments, and he was quieter and more inward when I visited during that time. She called me one afternoon while I was between client meetings and told me that he had expressed a wish to simplify his affairs, that thinking about the complexity of his estate arrangements was causing him stress, and that she was going to help him get everything into a more manageable shape. I asked what shape she had in mind. She said she had been speaking with an attorney about updating some of the documents. I asked if I could be included in the process. I asked this carefully, in the tone of a daughter concerned about her father's wishes and wanting to be supportive rather than an attorney who had just heard the word updating and immediately understood its implications. She said she thought it would be cleaner to work with just the two of them for now, that my father did not want to burden me with the details, that she would keep me informed. I said of course. I said I trusted her to know what he needed. I said I was glad he had someone managing those things so I could focus on just being with him. She said she knew how hard this was and that I was being so mature about everything. I said thank you and ended the call and sat in my parked car outside my office building for 6 minutes, breathing steadily, organizing what I felt into what I could use and what I needed to set aside for later. Then I went back upstairs and continued building the file. I kept visiting my father twice a week. I kept asking about his treatment and listening to the answers and bringing him the books he requested and watching documentaries about bridges and dams with him on his better evenings. I kept making coffee for Colette when she was at the house. I kept attending the hospital appointments that were open to family, sitting in waiting rooms and making conversation with Colette about small neutral things, the weather, a television series she was watching, something one of her friends had said at lunch. Inside all of that, I was building the chronological record. The documentation of every conversation that had been designed to manage or redirect me. The medical records I obtained through my father's authorized release, which established the pattern of his treatment schedule and the documented periods of cognitive fluctuation that correlated with his medication adjustments. The correspondence between myself and Colette that I had preserved from the beginning, not anticipating this specifically but because I preserved professional correspondence habitually, and which now provided a traceable record of her communications to me about estate matters. I filed a notice of intent with my own private docketing system, a record of when I would move and what I would file and in what sequence. I had learned from Constance Adler that the most important discipline in a contested estate matter was sequencing, not just having the right documents but knowing when to introduce them and in what order, building the record incrementally so that each filing reinforced and was supported by the ones before it. I was not ready yet. I would know when I was ready. I drove home one evening in the last week of March and the light was long and golden the way it gets in late spring when the days are stretching out past 6 in the evening, and I thought, as I sometimes allowed myself to think, about the version of this year that was supposed to have existed. The version where my father was ill and being cared for by people who loved him without agenda, where I visited and brought books and made tea and sat in the good kind of sadness that comes with a parent's illness, the sadness that is also made of love. I let myself feel the absence of that version of the year for exactly the length of the drive home, and then I put it away and went inside and made dinner. There is a kind of grief that you have to portion carefully because if you let it all in at once it will not leave you functional. I had learned this when my mother died, though what I had been managing then was simpler, a clean loss rather than a complicated one. This was different. This was the grief of losing something I had not known I was counting on until I discovered it was being taken. I saved it for later. I still have not spent all of it. I am not sure I will. Every day that passed without a move on my part was a day the filing grew stronger. Every conversation Colette had with me about my father's condition while the amended document sat in her bag was another entry in the chronological record. Every morning I set her coffee on the counter and watched her pick it up and thank me was another data point in the picture I was building of a woman who had made a specific calculation and believed she was operating inside a margin of safety that did not exist. She believed she was safe because she believed she knew who I was. She had known me for 4 years. She had watched me at hospital bedsides and kitchen counters and holiday tables and waiting rooms. She had formed a complete picture of Vera Callahan, and that picture was accurate in all its surface details and wrong at the foundation. She knew I was kind. She knew I was present. She knew I was managing my father's illness with a particular kind of patient love that she had perhaps mistaken for the absence of a harder capability. She did not know that the patient love and the harder capability lived in the same person. She did not know that the woman who brought soup when she was sick and laughed at her parking garage story and set coffee on the counter before she came downstairs was the same woman who had spent 11 years building documents designed to hold against exactly this kind of pressure. The thing about being underestimated is that it is only useful if you know it is happening. I had known since February. I had been using it since March. By the time she handed Gregory Holt the envelope, I had been using it for 3 months. And what I had built in those 3 months was not visible to anyone who was not looking for it, which meant it was not visible to her, which meant every assumption she had made about how this was going to go was built on a picture of me that was missing its most important dimension. I was not in a hurry. The document would wait. The filing would be ready when the filing was ready. And when it was ready it would be the most complete and precisely constructed instrument I had ever put into a probate court, because this one was personal in a way that none of the others had been, and I had learned a long time ago that the cases that matter most require the most careful work, not the least. I went back to the office the morning after our kitchen conversation and I opened the file I had been building and I added the notes from the phone call and then I continued drafting. I had been in Gregory Holt's building before, several times, on matters unrelated to my father or to Colette. The lobby had a smell I associated specifically with that address, recycled air and a particular carpet cleaner that I had always thought was too strong for the square footage, and underneath both of those something I had never been able to identify exactly, faintly metallic, possibly from the elevator. I noticed all of this on the morning of the courtesy review meeting because I was in the state of attention I entered when I walked into a room where something was going to happen. The invitation had come through Holt's assistant the previous week. Phrased as a courtesy, which was the first thing to notice, the framing of a legal proceeding as an act of generosity rather than a response to obligation. She had used the words interested parties, which told me they had checked enough of the original trust document to know I was a named beneficiary and that probate procedure required some form of notification before the amendment moved into its administrative phase, but not enough to understand the fuller architecture of what they were dealing with. I had dressed with deliberate care that morning. This is something I do for every significant meeting, not vanity but preparation, selecting what I wear as a kind of pre-meeting discipline, a final consolidation of intention before I walk in. I wore a suit I had bought 5 years earlier for a complex multi-party estate litigation that had taken 14 months to resolve in my client's favor. It was a dark charcoal, well-made, without the kind of detail that announced itself. The kind of suit that registers as serious only after someone has been in a room with you long enough to understand that you are serious. I arrived 4 minutes early, which I always do. Holt's assistant offered coffee and I accepted, because accepting coffee in an adversary's office is a small signal of comfort that is professionally useful. I sat with the cup and waited. Holt came in 2 minutes after the scheduled time. Confident enough not to be early, senior enough to make waiting unremarkable. He was accompanied by a junior associate I did not recognize, a young man carrying a portfolio whose job in the room was clearly to take notes and lend the impression of institutional weight. Holt did not introduce him. Holt shook my hand and sat across from me and opened the folder that was already on the table in front of his chair, placed before I arrived, the staging of the room having been considered. He had a good handshake, firm, brief, calibrated to convey confidence without aggression. He had done this enough times that the calibration was automatic. He thanked me for coming in. I said I was glad to be there. Both of these things were technically true and operationally meaningless, the verbal equivalent of adjusting your posture before a difficult conversation begins. He told me he appreciated my willingness to meet, that he understood this was a difficult period with my father's health, and that he wanted to walk me through the structure of the amended trust so I could understand what had been arranged. He said the word arranged with a slight emphasis that positioned it as settled rather than in process. I let him speak. He was thorough, Holt. He walked through the basic provisions of the amendment, the restructuring of the primary estate, the nature of Colette's role as trustee, the charitable remainder, the nominal distribution to me. He described the execution as clean, the witnesses as proper, the notarization as standard. He said my father had been of sound mind and had been advised of the contents. He paused when he had finished and looked at me with the particular expression that experienced attorneys develop for delivering outcomes to parties who are not going to be happy with them, a careful, modulated sympathy, warm enough to read as human but controlled enough not to invite challenge. I held the coffee cup in both hands. I said I had a few questions about the amendment procedure. He said of course. I asked, the original trust document contains a specific and binding amendment procedure in Article 7, Section 3. That procedure requires 3 things before any amendment can take legal effect. First, independent review of the proposed amendment by counsel appointed independently of both the trustee and the amending grantor. Second, 30 days written notice to all named beneficiaries prior to execution. Third, notarized confirmation from the original drafting attorney that the amendment conforms to the procedural requirements of the document. Could you walk me through how each of those conditions was satisfied in this case? Holt was still. It was a very controlled stillness, the stillness of a good attorney recognizing a problem and not yet knowing its dimensions. He said that the amendment had been executed in compliance with the standard requirements under state trust law. I said I was not asking about standard requirements. I said I was asking about the specific requirements in this document, which superseded general statutory defaults by virtue of the explicit amendment clause and which were binding on any subsequent amendment regardless of what state law would otherwise have permitted. I said that in the absence of compliance with those 3 conditions the amendment was void on its face. He said, with respect, where are you getting this reading of the document? I put my card on the table. Vera Callahan. Estate Planning and Probate Law. I told him I had been practicing trusts and estates in this county for 11 years, and that I had been appearing in probate court here for the same period, and that I knew the original trust in this matter in exact and complete detail because I was the attorney who had drafted it. The junior associate's pen stopped moving. Holt looked at my card. He looked at it for longer than he needed to, because he was reading it and reading it again and doing what I had done 3 months ago in my car in a parking garage, reorganizing everything he thought he knew about the situation against information that had not been present in his picture of it before. I watched him do this with the particular attention I had trained on every opposing counsel I had ever faced, reading the small adjustments of posture and breath and eye focus that tell you where the weight of a new piece of information is landing. It was landing hard. He said, I was not aware you had a legal background. I said I had more than a legal background. I said the original trust document had been drafted by my firm, under my supervision, and that my signature was on the drafting certificate at the back of the execution packet, which meant that the requirement of notarized confirmation from the original drafting attorney was a requirement for confirmation from me specifically, and that no one had contacted me. He said he would need to verify that. I said of course. I told him that while he was verifying it he should be aware that I had filed a petition for independent review of my father's testamentary capacity at the time of signing, supported by declarations from his primary care physician and 2 of his treating specialists, all of whom had documented concerns about the adequacy of informed consent under the conditions of his treatment on the relevant date. I told him I had also filed a formal notice of contest that morning in the probate court, supported by a detailed analysis of the amendment's procedural defects and the circumstances of its execution. I told him the filing number, from memory, because I had memorized it. I told him he could verify it before our coffee got cold. I watched him make the decision not to respond immediately. Good attorneys know when to stop talking. He made a note, closed his folder, said he would need to review the filings before we continued the conversation, and thanked me for bringing my concerns to his attention. I said I was glad we had had the chance to speak directly. We shook hands again. The handshake this time had a different quality from the first one. A man recalibrating in real time. I walked out through the lobby past the carpet cleaner smell and the faint metallic thing I had never identified and out into the morning, which was bright and slightly cold and smelled like the city waking up. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I drove anywhere. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I had learned a long time ago that the moments after something significant happens are the moments most likely to produce poor decisions, and that the discipline of sitting still for a few minutes and letting everything settle before you make your next move is one of the most undervalued practices in this profession. My hands were completely steady. I noticed this was something that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it. The particular satisfaction of a trained response performing as trained. I drove to my office. My associate Owen was at his desk when I came in and he looked up and said, "Well." I told him the filing was on the docket and Holt had seen the card. He said, "Does he understand the amendment clause issue yet?" I said, "He will by end of day." Owen nodded once and said he would have the supplemental capacity declaration formatted and ready for my review by 3. Then he went back to work. This was what I valued most about working with him. He understood that the plan was already built and his job was to execute his portion of it without requiring the whole picture to be narrated back to him. He was methodical and precise, and he had been with the practice long enough to understand that when I moved on something I had already thought it through completely, and his role in those moments was not to deliberate but to deliver. The formal response from Holt's office came 4 days later. It was measured and careful, acknowledging the filing without conceding anything, requesting additional time to review the capacity declarations, noting that the question of the amendment clause interpretation was a matter they intended to address fully. Reading it, I could track the places where the argument was strong and the places where it was struggling, because the amendment clause issue was not a matter of interpretation at all. The language was explicit. The clause meant exactly what it said, and what it said was that the amendment was void without the 3-part procedure, and none of the 3-part procedure had been followed. I began preparing the supplemental filing. Owen cross-referenced the medical timeline against the signing date and produced a chart that placed the execution window inside a documented period of medication adjustment that 3 physicians had independently flagged as inappropriate for major decisional tasks. The chart was clean and precise and would be difficult to argue against because it was built entirely from the treating team's own records. There was no interpretation required. The dates spoke for themselves and they spoke clearly. The capacity declarations from my father's physicians were the most painful material I handled in the entire proceeding. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were careful and clinical and written by people who had been managing my father's care with genuine skill and attention, and who had agreed, after reviewing the relevant dates and documentation, that the circumstances of the signing were inconsistent with what they would have required before advising a patient to execute a significant estate document. One of them, his primary treating physician, had noted in her declaration that she had expressed to Colette on 2 separate occasions during the treatment period her concern that major decisions about permanent matters should be made during periods of stability rather than during active medication adjustment phases, and that she had received no indication that either conversation had been relayed to my father or factored into any scheduling. Reading that, I felt something move through me that was not anger exactly. It was heavier than anger. Anger has an energy to it, a heat. What I felt was cold and significant and related to the difference between what I had believed Colette was and what she had actually been. The physician had told her. Had said plainly that this was not the time for major decisions. And Colette had scheduled the signing anyway, had brought the document anyway, had placed it in front of my father anyway, and had not mentioned the physician's warning to anyone. That was not an oversight. That was a choice. I filed the supplemental materials. I notified the probate court of the specific amendment clause defect with a detailed legal memorandum that left no room for the interpretation argument Holt's response had gestured toward. I filed the bar complaint against Holt, not vindicatively, but because the record required it and because Constance Adler had taught me that accountability in legal practice was not optional for the people who believed in the system they worked inside. If you drafted an amendment to a trust without reading the original document carefully enough to identify a binding amendment procedure, you had failed in a fundamental professional duty, and that failure needed to be in the record regardless of what else was happening. The work of those weeks was dense and continuous in a way that I found, unexpectedly, clarifying. There is something about work that is both technically demanding and personally meaningful that produces a particular quality of focus I have not found in anything else. Every filing was precise because precision was required and also because imprecision in any document that bore my father's name and mine was something I was constitutionally unable to tolerate. Every declaration was complete because completeness was the only form of respect I knew how to give to what had been done to him. I went to the hospital in the evenings. I sat beside his bed and we watched the second half of a documentary about the construction of a famous suspension bridge, and he told me several detailed things about the engineering challenges that were so precisely like him, so specifically the particular man he had always been, that I had to work to keep my face ordinary and my voice steady. He talked about load distribution and cable tension and the specific problem of building in a riverbed with unpredictable geology, and I listened and asked questions and thought about the fish dish on his desk at home and the note inside it. I told him the garden had come in a little ahead of schedule this year. He said that was because we had the right soil amendment in the fall. I said I thought he was right. He held my hand for a while after that, and neither of us said anything, and outside the window the afternoon moved through its late colors, and I sat beside him and let myself be just his daughter for the length of that documentary and the hour after it, and saved the attorney for the morning. There is a particular discipline in keeping those two things separate, in being fully present in one mode and fully present in the other without letting either contaminate the other. I had been practicing it for months by then, the clean division between the daughter at the bedside and the attorney at the desk, and I had found that the division, rather than fragmenting me, had given each version of myself more room to operate. At the hospital I was not carrying the weight of the filing. At the desk I was not carrying the grief of the bedside. Both things were true and both things were mine, and I moved between them the way I had learned to move between any two states that required different things from me, completely, without half measures. This is what preparation actually looks like from the inside. Not drama. Not urgency. The daily execution of a plan that was built before the crisis became visible, moving from step to step with the steadiness of someone who knows where they are going because they drew the map themselves. I was 41 steps into 43. The last two were coming. The probate court appointed an independent guardian ad litem within 10 days of the notice of contest. Her name was Margaret Soto, and I had appeared in matters where she had served in this role before. She was deliberate and genuinely independent in the sense that mattered. She formed her positions based on documentation and direct assessment, not based on which party presented better or more sympathetically. She met with my father twice, privately, and reviewed the medical declarations and the relevant documents, and filed her initial assessment with the court within the timeline the judge had specified. Her assessment established, for the formal record, that there were significant questions regarding both the procedural validity of the amendment and the circumstances of the signing that required judicial resolution. This was what I had needed the record to contain, not a determination, but a documented acknowledgement that the questions were real and substantive enough to require full adjudication. With that assessment in the file, the amendment could not quietly proceed. Everything had to come into the light, which was the only place I had ever needed it to be. Colette retained Sandra Vreeland within the week. Vreeland was a solid attorney in family law with a sensible reputation, not brilliant but not sloppy, and she was smart enough to call me 3 days after the guardian's appointment to ask whether there was a path toward resolution. I said there was. I told her it ran through a full production of all communications between Colette and Gregory Holt from the initial engagement forward, all representations made to my father about the purpose and effect of the amendment, a formal accounting of any actions taken in relation to my father's estate or finances in the 12 months preceding the amendment's execution, and a deposition of Colette in which she would answer specific questions under oath about the circumstances of the signing. Vreeland said she would discuss it with her client. I said I expected nothing less. I had not told anyone yet what I had found in the course of my research into Gregory Holt's practice history. I was waiting for the right moment, the moment at which the introduction of that information would have the greatest formal impact. Timing in contested estate proceedings is everything. Not every piece of information belongs in the first filing. Some things are worth protecting until the moment their introduction will be most clearly felt and most difficult to absorb without the kind of defensive response that requires time to mount. I wanted Colette in a deposition chair before she knew the full dimensions of what I had assembled. I wanted her answers to the early questions on the record before she had any reason to be careful about the later ones. What I had found was this. Gregory Holt's name appeared in a contested probate matter filed 4 years earlier in Westfield County, the county to the north of ours. The petitioner was a woman named Ruth Emery, 56 years old at the time of the filing, a retired school librarian who had spent 18 years as the primary caregiver for her uncle, a widower named Gerald Emery who had accumulated a modest but significant estate over his working life. Gerald Emery had executed a trust during his healthy years that named Ruth as his sole beneficiary. 2 years before his death he had acquired a companion, a woman who had entered his life through a senior social group and who had, over the following 18 months, become his primary daily support and eventually the person who managed his household and accompanied him to his appointments and, it appeared, introduced him to an attorney who could help him get his affairs in order before anything happened. The companion's name was Patricia Wells. The trust amendment that had been executed before Gerald Emery's death redirected his entire estate away from Ruth and to Patricia Wells. Holt had drafted the amendment. The original trust in that matter had not contained the same bespoke amendment clause that my father's trust contained, which meant the procedural challenge Ruth's attorney had attempted was on weaker ground. The petition had been dismissed on technical grounds after 8 months of proceedings. Patricia Wells had received the estate. Gerald Emery's house, his savings, the investments he had accumulated across 4 decades of careful work, all of it transferred to a woman who had known him for 18 months. Ruth Emery had lost everything she had spent 18 years working alongside her uncle to help him build. Patricia Wells was Colette's sister. The same attorney. The same structure. The same approach: identify an isolated elderly person with an estate worth taking, establish proximity and trust over a period of months, time the amendment to a period of diminished capacity or attention, and execute before anyone with standing could organize opposition. The method had worked once. They had counted on it working again. I had sat with that knowledge for a long time the night I found it. Not because I was surprised, exactly. The existence of a prior victim had been something I had begun to suspect once I understood fully what Colette and Holt had been doing and how precisely it had been designed. Sophisticated predation of this kind rarely begins with the first case. The method was too clean, too practiced, too aware of the right vulnerabilities to exploit. Someone had done this before and learned from doing it, and the learning had been applied here with the confidence of people who believed the pattern was going to hold because it had held before. What I felt, sitting with that knowledge, was a shift in the nature of what I was doing. It had begun as the protection of my father and the recovery of his estate. It had now become something larger and more necessary. Ruth Emery had not had the right attorney at the right time. She had not had someone who understood the specific vulnerabilities in the amendment or the procedural ground on which it could be challenged. She had lost, and the loss was permanent in ways that could not now be fully undone. But the pattern that had produced it could be documented and placed into a formal record in a way that would make it visible, and in a way that might make some form of recovery possible for what remained reachable. I called Ruth Emery on a Thursday evening. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was the kind of even that comes from having been through something that required you to build a new floor underneath yourself because the old one was gone. not cold. Steady in a different way than before. Not immediately trusting when I introduced myself, which I respected. I told her who I was and what I was working on and what I had found and what I believed it meant for the matter she had brought and lost 4 years ago. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, I knew. I knew it was not just me. There was something about the way it was all set up that felt too practiced. Like they had done it before and knew which steps to take and which questions would never get asked. But I could not find the other case. I looked and I could not find it. I told her I had found it now. I told her I could not promise her an outcome. I said the original dismissal created real complications and that some of what had been lost might not be recoverable through any legal mechanism currently available to her. The house was likely gone. Some accounts likely liquidated. But the pattern, documented across 2 estates in 2 counties with the same attorney and the same family's involvement, created a foundation for claims that went beyond the original contest. Fraud. Undue influence at a systematic level. Elder financial abuse. These were serious designations with serious institutional consequences, and the documentation I had assembled across both matters gave them evidentiary support that had not existed before. She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Everything you kept." She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said she had kept everything. She said she had 4 boxes in a closet in her spare bedroom that she had not been able to open in 2 years because she could not bring herself to look at it and also could not bring herself to throw it away. I told her I would send her my contact information and that we would schedule a time for her to bring them in. After I hung up I sat in my office for a long time. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that accumulates in spaces where work has been done and is now done for the day. I thought about Ruth Emery keeping those boxes for 4 years, not because she knew someone would call, but because she could not bring herself to act as if it had not happened. Because the injustice of it had not become less real simply because it had not been remedied. Because some people keep things not out of hope but out of refusal to let the wrong thing be treated as though it had been right. I understood that refusal completely. I had been living inside a version of it for months. The deposition of Colette took place on a Wednesday in the 2nd month of the formal proceedings. I appeared as opposing counsel, which meant I was in the room with her for the first time in an official capacity, across a table rather than across a kitchen counter or a hospital waiting room chair. I had spent a great deal of time in the preceding weeks thinking about what that would feel like, sitting across from someone I had genuinely cared about in a context that made the full nature of what she had done unavoidable for both of us. I had thought about it not to manage my feelings in the moment but to know what those feelings were so they would not arrive unexpectedly when I needed to be completely present in the work. She was composed. I had expected this. She was a person who performed well under social pressure because she had, I understood now, been performing under one kind of social pressure or another for as long as she had been doing what she was doing. She answered the early questions carefully, her attorney's preparation visible in the calibration of her responses, specific enough not to seem evasive, brief enough not to offer additional surface area for follow-up. I let her build comfort with the rhythm of the questioning. I let the early exchanges go long enough that the pace began to feel established, that she had found the groove of the proceeding and was operating inside it with something close to ease. And then I introduced the documentation relating to Patricia Wells and Ruth Emery and Gerald Emery's estate. The change in Colette's composure was small and specific. Not a collapse. A recalibration, a fraction of a second longer on an intake of breath, a micro-adjustment in how she held her shoulders. I had seen it before, in depositions, in the moment when a witness realizes that the question being asked is coming from information they did not know the opposing side had. It is a particular kind of stillness, different from the composed stillness of someone who is prepared and confident. It is the stillness of a person who is rapidly reorganizing everything they thought they knew about the room they are in. Vreeland called a recess. During the recess I stepped into the corridor and stood near the window at the end of the hallway and looked out at the parking structure across the street and thought about my father and the fish dish and the 3 words and how I had tried, across all of these months, to be worthy of them. I did not feel triumphant in that corridor. I felt the weight of what had been necessary. The distance between the Sunday lunch where I had first met Colette and the deposition room I had just left was not a distance I would have chosen to travel. But I had traveled it, and I had done it correctly, and the record would hold what had happened. The deposition resumed. Colette invoked her Fifth Amendment rights on 17 questions relating to Patricia Wells, Gerald Emery, and the timing and method of her engagement with Gregory Holt. Each invocation was noted in the record by the court reporter in the careful neutral language of someone whose job was to document rather than interpret. Each invocation built the shape of what was being refused to answer. 17 silences in a formal record are not nothing. They are a shape that a reader can see. My father called me that evening. He had been told about the proceedings by the guardian ad litem, whose role required her to keep him informed at a level appropriate to his comprehension and medical condition. He did not say anything for the first few seconds after I picked up. I could hear his breathing, slow and careful, the way it had been since the treatment had changed the rhythm of things for him. Then he said my name. Just that. Vera. I said, I am here. He said he had been sitting with what the guardian had told him since that morning and he did not know how to begin. He said he had been trying to understand what he had signed and the more he tried to reconstruct it the more certain he was that he had not understood what it was. That he had been told it was administrative. That Colette had said it was a simplification and he had trusted that word because he had trusted her and because he had been tired in a way that made the ordinary weight of a document feel heavier than it should have. He said he remembered the day but he did not remember reading it carefully. He remembered a pen being placed in his hand. He remembered someone saying his name twice, gently, the way you say someone's name when you are guiding them towards something rather than asking. He said, I did not do this to you. I need you to know I would never have done this to you. I told him I knew. I told him I had known from the moment I read the document that it was not something he had chosen with full understanding. Because I knew him, and I knew the choices he made when he was fully himself, and this was not one of them. I told him that the document I had found bore his signature but not his intention, and that the law understood the difference between those two things, and that I had spent the past months making sure that difference was visible in every place it needed to be visible. He was quiet again. Then he said, You built that clause in there. The one that stopped it. I said yes. He said, You built it because you knew something like this could happen someday. I said I had built it because he had asked me to build something that could not be touched without his full understanding and participation, and I had taken that instruction seriously, the way I had always taken his instructions seriously, because he was precise about what he asked for and I had learned a long time ago that precision in a request deserved precision in the response. He said, very quietly, I gave you that instruction because I trusted you more than anyone. I did not say anything for a moment. The evening was going dark outside my window and the office was quiet around me and I held the phone and thought about 12 years of work built on a single conversation at a desk with a fish dish between us, and how the thing he had trusted me to build had done exactly what he had trusted me to build it to do, and how that was the most complete professional satisfaction I had ever felt and also the saddest because it had required all of this to demonstrate. I told him that trust was the thing I had been trying to honor the entire time. That everything I had done across the past months had been an attempt to be worthy of it. That every morning I had made coffee for Colette and every evening I had come to the hospital to sit with him had been in service of making sure the thing he had entrusted to me was protected until I was ready to protect it formally. He said he was sorry. Not the kind of sorry that asks to be absolved. The kind that simply acknowledges weight, the full and precise weight of what had happened and how close it had come to succeeding, and what it had required of me to prevent it from succeeding. He said he was sorry it had happened while he was sick, sorry that I had had to manage it while also managing his illness, sorry that the thing he had meant most precisely, the part about making sure I was held, had been used as the instrument of exactly the opposite. I told him there was nothing between us that needed to be repaired. I told him the thing between us had never been what was under attack. I told him the document had held and he was held and that was what mattered. We stayed on the phone for a long time after that. Neither of us talking much. Just the sound of each other there in the quiet. The furnace cycling. The clock somewhere in my office. The particular texture of being two people who had come through something significant and were still, unmistakably, on the same side of it. Colette moved out of the house on Birch Hollow Road on a Saturday morning in late spring. I was not there. I heard about it that evening from my father's neighbor, who knew the history in the way that close neighbors know things and who called to make sure I was aware. By the following week, Freeland had opened settlement discussions. Holt had filed a motion to withdraw from the matter, citing a conflict of interest he had not previously identified, which was the legal record's way of acknowledging that he had understood what was coming and had made the calculation that leaving was better than remaining inside it. The bar complaint I had filed against him moved into its formal review phase the same week he withdrew. Patricia Wells, whose name now appeared in the formal record of 2 county probate proceedings with the same pattern of conduct documented in both, retained her own separate counsel. The civil action I had been drafting in parallel, naming Colette and Patricia jointly and asserting fraud and elder financial abuse across both matters, was filed the following Thursday. Owen processed the filing and sent me a single message that said, "On the docket." I replied, "Thank you." The amended trust was formally declared void by the court 6 weeks after the deposition. The original document, the one I had drafted 12 years ago at my father's desk with the fish dish between us, was reinstated in its full and intended form. The estate was intact. It would go where it was always meant to go. This was not a moment I celebrated. It was a correction. There is a difference between those two things, and honoring the difference felt important. A celebration is for something gained. A correction is for something restored to where it should always have been, and the restoration, however complete, does not undo the months it required or the grief it cost or the knowledge it produced about people I had loved without reservation. I called Ruth Emery that evening to tell her where things stood and that we would begin her matter in earnest the following week. She thanked me. She said she had spent 4 years not knowing whether anyone would ever make that call. I told her I was glad I could be the one to make it. My father came home in early June. He was stable, the treatment not finished but managed, the crisis phase behind him, and what lay ahead a long maintenance and monitoring process that his physicians approached with guarded and genuine optimism. I drove him home from the hospital on a Tuesday morning when the light was the specific pale gold of early summer, low and unhurried, the kind of light that seems to suggest that whatever comes next will have enough time. He had asked, the day before he came home, that I move the fish dish from his study to the table beside his bed. He said he wanted it there when he woke up in the mornings so that he would know exactly where he was. I went to the house the day before his discharge and moved it carefully, the same ceramic weight it had always been, and set it on the bedside table where he would see it before anything else when he opened his eyes. I put a small folded note inside its open mouth, in the same place he had put his note for me all those years ago. My note said the same thing his had said to me, but adjusted for what I needed him to understand now. I wrote, "You are held." He found it the first morning and called me from his room while I was making breakfast in the kitchen downstairs, and he read it to me out loud in a voice that was careful and deliberate and working to stay steady, and then he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Yes." I said, "Yes." We did not say much else. It was enough. It was, in the way that precise and simple things sometimes are, more than enough. The house on Birch Hollow Road settled back into itself over the weeks that followed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the incremental way that spaces re-inhabit themselves when a disrupting presence has been removed. The kitchen felt different in a way I could not have described exactly but recognized immediately, the particular quality of rooms that have returned to what they were before something was introduced that did not belong. The study felt different. The specific texture of the quiet in the evenings, when my father was resting and the light was going down outside and the trees in the garden were moving the way they moved in June, slow and full and unhurried, was a quiet I recognized from my childhood. Not a happy quiet exactly. An honest one. The quiet of a house that knows what it is. I began visiting more regularly. Every other evening for the first month, then settling into a rhythm that worked for both of us, twice a week, with flexibility for the medical appointments and the days when he wanted company that was not structured around anything specific, when he simply wanted another person in the house doing whatever they were doing nearby. I brought the tea my mother had kept, the specific loose-leaf variety, from a small shop in the north part of the city that I had been ordering for years because it was the closest thing I had found to what she used to make. I made it the way she had made it, steeped long, in a wide-mouthed cup so it could cool to exactly the right temperature before he lifted it. He held it in both hands and looked out the window at the garden and talked to me about what needed doing in the beds. He said the roses had gotten ahead of themselves. He said the soil in the far corner needed amendment before the fall. He said the specific name of a plant in the border that he had been meaning to move for 2 years and had not gotten to before everything happened, and he said it with the particular precision he brought to anything he had been thinking about for a long time and had finally found the moment to say. I wrote all of it down. Not because he had asked me to. Because his voice in those conversations was the voice of someone who was still here and still paying attention and still making plans, and I wanted a record of that. I reopened the practice under my full name in July. Vera Callahan Law. I had never officially closed it during the probate proceedings. Owen had managed the existing client work with care and precision, keeping everything current, nothing dropped. But I had pulled back from new engagements, from the active presence in the professional community that was part of building and maintaining a practice, and the return required a kind of deliberate re-entry that I had thought about carefully before beginning it. I did not announce the reopening. I did not circulate the story of what had happened, not in the way that a different kind of person might have, not as a narrative of triumph or vindication. What I circulated, through the ordinary channels of professional engagement, was the quality of the work. New filings. A consultation I gave pro bono for a legal aid clinic in the county on estate planning for elderly clients on fixed incomes. A presentation I gave to a local bar association continuing education series on bespoke amendment procedures in revocable trusts, which was perhaps the closest I came to a public acknowledgement of what had happened, since anyone in the room who had been following the probate court filings in the county over the past several months would have understood exactly which estate had produced my interest in that specific topic. 2 new client referrals came from the judge who had presided over my father's matter, who had said in passing after the void ruling that the original document was one of the most carefully constructed instruments she had reviewed in years on the bench. I thanked her and told her it had been important to the person it was built for. She said she could tell. She said that the level of care in a document told you something about the relationship between the attorney and the client that no other evidence could, and that what the Fish Dish Trust, as she had come to think of it based on Owen's description of the filing conference, communicated about that relationship was something she did not often see. I told her I would tell my father she had said so. She said please do. The first new matter I opened formally under the reopened practice was Ruth Emery's. This was not a simple case, and I had told Ruth that from the beginning with a directness I owed her after 4 years of a situation no one had been straight with her about. The original dismissal had created a factual and legal landscape that was complicated in ways I had to be honest about. Some of what had been lost in the years since Gerald Emery's death was genuinely unrecoverable through any mechanism the law currently provided. The house had been sold. Some of the accounts had been liquidated and the proceeds moved through a sequence of transfers that would require significant forensic tracing work to follow with any precision. Patricia Wells had not been careless with what she had taken. She had been, in the way of people who have done something like this before and understand the risks, careful about making recovery difficult. But the pattern that Ruth and I had assembled together, combining her documentation with mine, told a story that was larger than any individual recovery amount. It told the story of a systematic approach to elder financial abuse, executed with the participation of a licensed attorney across a period of years against multiple identified victims. That story, placed into the right formal records and submitted to the right institutional authorities, had consequences that extended well beyond any single estate proceeding. The bar complaint against Holt now covered both matters. The civil action named both sisters. The Attorney General's Elder Financial Abuse Unit had accepted the referral and opened its own parallel inquiry, which introduced a level of institutional consequence that had not been present in the original Emery proceeding because Ruth had not had anyone capable of constructing and delivering that referral. Ruth brought her boxes on a Thursday afternoon in August. 4 of them, as she had said, carried in 2 trips from her car, and she set them on my conference table with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that had cost her a great deal to keep. We went through them together, the 2 of us on opposite sides of the table, Owen at the corner making notes, and the documentation was as complete as she had promised and in several instances better than I had expected. Her uncle had been a keeper of things. Letters, receipts, notes he had made to himself about conversations he had found significant or confusing. Ruth had preserved all of it, adding her own documentation alongside his, building without realizing it a chronological record that tracked the progression of Patricia Wells's influence over Gerald Emery's household decisions from the early months of their acquaintance through the final weeks before the amendment was executed. There were things in those boxes I had not anticipated. Written exchanges between Gerald and Patricia in which Patricia had, with practiced gentleness, introduced corrections to his understanding of what Ruth had said or done, small consistent redirections designed to widen the distance between them without any single moment being large enough to name. I recognized the technique. I had seen a version of it in Colette's management of my father's access to information about his own estate. The method was the same at its core. Not the creation of open conflict but the careful erosion of the relationship being targeted, accomplished through small steady pressure applied in private over enough time to reshape the landscape. Owen looked up from his notes at one point and said, very quietly, that this was exactly the kind of record you needed and almost never found intact. Ruth looked at him and said she had not kept it because she thought someone would call. She had kept it because she could not make herself act as if it had not happened. He said, that is why we can do something now. She looked at the boxes for a long time. Then she said, my uncle was a good man. He was careful and kind and he worked his whole life at things that mattered to him. He deserved better than what happened to him in the end. I said he did. I said I was going to make sure the record reflected that as clearly as the law allowed, and that the record was going to be in the right places to do the most it could for what was still recoverable. She nodded. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she said, I want you to know I am not doing this because I think I will get the money back. I am doing this because I do not want it to happen to someone else. I told her that was the best reason there was. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time with the door open and the late afternoon light coming in through the windows at the angle it came at in August, low and warm and specific to that time of day in that season. I thought about what she had said and about what it meant to do work not because you expected to recover what was taken but because you refused to let the pattern that took it continue unchallenged. That was a particular kind of moral seriousness that I had deep respect for, the willingness to spend what you had left, your time and your energy and whatever patience remained after 4 years of grieving alone, on something that might not return anything to you directly but that might stop the same thing from happening to someone who could not afford to lose what you lost. I thought about my mother's recipe cards and the cedar box with the slightly uneven initials and the way the most foundational things were always buried deepest, the things learned first, the things that did not need to be near the surface because they were the surface. I thought about the 3 words my father had written and put inside the open mouth of a ceramic fish dish on the morning I started my career, and about how I had spent 11 years trying to understand fully what they meant, and about how I had come, through everything that had happened in the past year, to understand them more precisely than I ever had before. Build things that hold. Not just documents. Not just trust instruments and amendment clauses and procedural protections designed to make the right thing difficult to undo. Those were the mechanisms. What they were in service of was something larger, the idea that the people you love deserve structures built around them that will not give way under pressure, that will not collapse when someone better positioned or less scrupulous decides to test them, that will still be standing when the testing is over and the dust has settled and the record has been read and the correction has been made. My father called in the last week of August to tell me the garden was doing better. He said the roses were the best they had been since the year my mother planted them. He said they had come back stronger for the season being difficult, which he thought was probably true of most things that were built right in the first place. He said the tea was almost gone and would I bring more on Saturday. I said I would. He said he was glad I was coming. I said I was glad too. I wrote it in my calendar, Saturday. T. The good kind. The kind my mother kept. I want to say one last thing from inside this story before it closes, and I want to say it the way I have said everything else in it, from the only place I know how to speak from honestly, which is the place where all of this actually happened and where the weight of it still lives alongside everything else that is also true. There is so much I am still carrying from these months. The grief of what Colette was to me before I understood what she was also doing. The particular sorrow of loving someone genuinely and then learning that the shape of their love for you was not what you had believed, that what you had trusted had been, at its foundation, a position taken rather than a feeling held. I do not think that grief resolves cleanly. I do not think it is supposed to. I think it becomes part of how you see, part of the reason you build things designed to hold, part of the reason you sit across from someone like Ruth Emery and recognize immediately what she means when she says she could not make herself act as if it had not happened. Because you know that feeling from the inside. Because you have held that same refusal in your own hands for longer than you wanted to and kept going anyway. If you have ever found yourself looking at a document designed to erase you, or sitting beside someone you loved who was being quietly moved towards something they would not have chosen for themselves, I want you to know that the law exists for exactly this. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not without the kind of sustained and careful work that asks everything of you over a longer period than you feel you have the endurance for. But it exists. Documents can be contested. Patterns can be proven. The structures that were built to hold can be restored when they have been attacked, if there is someone present who understands how they were built. The people who prepare, who document, who understand the architecture of what they are working with, are significantly harder to erase than anyone who is trying to erase them ever imagines. If this story is still with you, stay with this channel. What comes next is more of exactly this, the cases that needed someone with the right preparation, the right patience, and the right refusal to act as if the wrong thing had not happened. Every story begins with someone who was told there was nothing they could do. I want you here for what happens after that.